Hello, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, along with CBS Sports draft analyst Chris Trapasso. And if you're watching on YouTube, yes, we are sitting in a hotel in Indianapolis, right across the street from Lucas Oil Stadium, where some of the action will happen. The rest also in the Indiana Convention Center, where I will be doing shows here all week along with Chris. What is up, man? Great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me down here to Indy. Like you mentioned, the convention center, it's like people think that it's all going on inside Lucas Oil, but the convention center, in terms of media, GMs, head coaches, you're walking down the halls, you see a lot of it. So, and they're right next to each other. So this is really my favorite week of the pre-draft process. It is the ultimate networking event in NFL media.
It certainly is. And our current situation is not the most beautiful because we wanted to jump in and start potting right away. And we can't actually get our media credentials until tomorrow morning, which is probably when you're listening to this. So by the time you're listening to this, we will be over at the convention center. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is going to talk on Tuesday morning, losing track of what day it is already. And so we'll have a reaction to him. You're going to be at his podium session. He also does a side session with beat reporters. We'll compare notes on that and have an instant reaction for everyone as soon as we're done talking with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, and then lots of things to come. But we wanted to do a preview of the entire week. Yeah. So not just what Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell are going to say, which I'm not sure exactly how much they're going to say. We'll find out. I mean, last year, I thought that they were really willing to break down their philosophies. But
that's what's fun, too.
Right? Oh, yeah. It is. You learn a lot. But now that we've been through it, like, are they going to be as open, or are we going to find out some things we didn't expect? I guess we'll learn that tomorrow. But I really wanted to get into the things we're looking for on the whole around the league and some draft prospects that you're looking at. But I think we have to begin in a little bit of a different place, which is the quarterback situation around the league. NFL Network reported today that Derek Carr is going to be here in Indy. There he is. No, I'm just kidding. But Derek Carr is going to be here in Indy meeting with teams. And I think that the Rodgers situation and the Derek Carr situation really shape how the entire rest of the league, including the teams drafting quarterbacks, is going to shake out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does, but right now, I mean, and probably when this comes out, there could be Derek Carr could be signing with someone and could throw a whole wrench into this. It feels like with the Jets and the Raiders being two of the teams most talked about in both of those sweepstakes for Derek Carr and Aaron Rodgers, that it doesn't feel like those teams want to look into the draft at the quarterback position. So unless it's like a surprise team like the Panthers, I don't think it'll be the Texans, obviously, or the Colts. They've kind of rolled the dice on the veteran market and failed the last couple of years. It will shape a little bit of it, but I think in general, the teams that everyone has identified as the quarterback needy teams in the draft, I think will kind of stay put regardless of where even someone like Jimmy Garoppolo ultimately goes.
Yeah, I think the Raiders are maybe the most interesting one here because they're in a position where they want to win. They got Devontae Adams, but yet they're drafting very high.
Yeah,
and it's hard, I think, to look at that situation and not say, boy, if you could land yourself a CJ Stroud, or if you could land yourself even Anthony Richardson and were patient enough, or could ask Devontae Adams for his patience, then you might be in a better long-term situation than if you got Rodgers and he isn't what he used to be, or you get left out of the Rodgers thing and you end up with Jimmy Garoppolo, or you get left out of that thing and you end up with what, like Ryan Tannehill or something.
Yikes.
Like, none of these situations are great. So how the moving and shaking happens here, because this is where rumors happen. This is where 1 a.m. conversations at steakhouses happen, and we start to find out what's kind of going on. But yeah, we might have an answer on Derek Carr by the end of the week where he wants to go. But I think that the best place to begin with this is the quarterbacks in this draft, because there are 4 projected at the top, and Anthony Richardson, in my mind, is the most interesting by far. And there's news today that he is going to participate in all of the events.
We're
going to have real numbers on Anthony Richardson to compare to all these other guys. And I think they have to be looking at some of the records that have been set for athleticism by a quarterback. But what do you think of that decision from Anthony Richardson to put it all down kind of on tape here in Indianapolis?
It's what he had to do. I mean, I've put 2 weeks ago, I moved Anthony Richardson to the number 1 overall pick in my mock because I put the Colts trading up for Bryce Young over and over and over again. And then it dawned on me that if Anthony Richardson works out at the combine, and there was kind of an extra caveat that if also Bryce Young did, that there was going to be a huge disparity in their height, in their weight, in their arm talent, and their athleticism. Now, Bryce Young is not working out. That makes sense from his perspective as well, because you can just say, hey, look at the last 2 years, all the poise I showed, all the big throws that I made. But it was an absolute must decision for Anthony Richardson. Obviously, the quarterbacks all have to weigh in, and we'll still see that big disparity between Anthony Richardson and Bryce Young. But you're right. I think we're going to see an all-time workout from Anthony Richardson. And it maybe not the fastest 40 ever and the highest vertical, but at 6'4" and 230 plus pounds, when these other quarterbacks don't really have that height and weight combination. So it was a smart move for him. And I think after the combine, because I am expecting him to test that well, then we'll start to hear could he be quarterback 2? Could he maybe be quarterback 1 on some teams' boards? It will really just depend on the flavor that those teams like and the type of quarterback that they want to roll the dice on in the draft.
So I think this puts a little pressure on Will Levis to do
the
same.
For sure.
And what is CJ Stroud's situation? Is he going to,
he's throwing, and I'm pretty sure he's working out as well. He's kind of the tweener in this group. And he still, even though 2 straight years of very clean film, he can do well for himself, where no one's expecting him to run like Will Levis or Anthony Richardson. But if he's just not like terribly unathletic, I think people say, okay, he's a great pocket passer, also very poised, very young. He can make himself some money this week as well.
Isn't it interesting with this group that you have kind of a myriad of different heights and sizes?
Yeah.
And it's like it's got something for everybody. Will Levis' arm strength is absolutely preposterous.
Yes.
He can throw it through some sort of very thick wall, I would say. And Richardson is more of the runner. And a lot of the conversation actually reminds me of Jalen Hurts. Only I think Richardson throws it better than Jalen Hurts because his arm strength is much greater, but he also throws it into the ground sometimes when you're like, what? The throw was right there, man. Like, what happened on that throw? There's a little bit of Vince Young throws with him where you just don't understand, but maybe that's a technical thing that can be fixed. And then here's Stroud that looks to me like an NFL quarterback. I mean, drops back, hits the back foot, great technique. And his game, his last impression against Georgia, was so phenomenal. He was making plays, he was competing. And I also think, and this is just my impression from watching a handful of games of his, listening to the broadcasts and everything else and features and reading about him, is that he's the character guy. Like, if you want character from your quarterback, CJ Stroud is like through the roof. I think that this makes it difficult to really know who is going to be number 1 because it's kind of a preference thing.
And going back over the years, I mean, we have the Joe Burrow year and the Trevor Lawrence year. Beyond that, Kyler Murray in 2019, I remember being at the combine, and this is where maybe the Cardinals could actually pick him number 1 overall. In 2018, it was up until the combine and really almost until draft day, it was either going to be Josh Allen or Sam Darnold at number 1 overall. So for it to be kind of up in the air who that top quarterback is going to be when there's not a Joe Burrow or a Trevor Lawrence is not really that unprecedented. And I think all these quarterbacks, like you mentioned, different sizes, they have different strengths and weaknesses. There isn't that generational, quote unquote, generational prospect in this draft. I think there will be truly a total scattering of how teams have these quarterbacks ranked. And to me, what I really think that it comes down to is top of the draft. Do you want to roll the dice on a quarterback that has a high floor in Bryce Young, where you're like, all right, he's going to understand protections right away. He's going to be accurate. He might not ever be to that Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes or Justin Herbert physical skill set level. But we're fine with that. And maybe we'll ultimately lose a game where he just can't make the throws of the other team's quarterback in the playoffs. Or do we roll the dice on the other end of it? And you and I usually gravitate toward this side. We did it with Trey Lance and Zach Wilson. Do you roll the dice on the Anthony Richardson type that's raw, needs to get better with his decision-making, not throwing the ball into the turf when there's an open drag route right in front of him, but has the ability, if things, not just individually with his development, but the team around him wise, that he can go toe-to-toe with a Patrick Mahomes or a Josh Allen with throws, with the ability to scramble, the designed run game. That's just where I see the best quarterbacks in today's game. So I lean in that direction way more than I used to even like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that I used to also believe that if you didn't have the perfect accuracy coming out, you might as well just not even bother.
Me too.
But there were so many quarterbacks that didn't and went bust that I think that we had this run of being like, oh, yeah, like Paxton Lynch or something who I just saw in the XFL. Like, it was just kind of a run of, well, the guy, who was the guy who became a pitcher? It was a Hackenberg. Christian Hackenberg.
Oof, he was bad too.
Right. It was just this monster arm, huge dude. Okay, well, that doesn't matter if you can't play football. But I think that some of these guys, when you add a running element to it, then you're talking about something different. And also, like when they said Josh Allen couldn't improve, and then he did. And when then Patrick Mahomes can't improve his footwork, and then he did. It's like
Jalen Hurts too.
Right. There are things that guys can get better on. The one thing that I missed with Zach Wilson, I think, that I just never came across, but now in hindsight, is that he wasn't his team's captain at BYU.
Ooh.
And that's just weird. Like, if you were like the guy.
And they were good too.
Right,
they were a good team. Yeah.
It's like, wait, he wasn't the captain? Why wouldn't they vote him a captain? And then
now we kind of know.
Doing things with teammates, moms or whatever, or their friends, or I don't know, something like that. But beyond his off-field exploits, just like he showed no leadership capabilities in the NFL either. But I think with the guys that we have this year, every one of them, I mean, Bryce Young has that, and that
they seem
mentality.
Focused.
Yeah, they seem much more focused. But
yeah.
I don't know if we would have known that about Zach Wilson coming out either. Like, how someone reacts is going to be hard. So I wanted to ask you, because the Vikings are at least tangentially in this conversation, if one guy was going to drop out of the 4 quarterbacks, who would it be?
Man, that's tough because
is the answer just nobody?
No, I think one will ultimately fall. I mean, with Justin Fields going all the way to 11 in 2021, I think a lot of people were surprised at that because he was check the size box, athleticism through the roof, big arm. His film at Ohio State was really good. I think there will be one. Because, again, this is not a group of 4 like 2018 prospects where everyone just loves everything that they do. It would probably be Anthony Richardson just because I do think for as many teams that will be enamored with what he can do from a physical standpoint, there are, some games where he had 6 completions going into the third quarter, things like that. It's probably Anthony Richardson, but I think after this week, though, that might change. That if it's an all-time workout, that could change. Maybe it's ultimately Will Levis, who's older than Richardson and didn't build on a really strong 2021 this past year when he lost some talent to the NFL, offensive line receiver. Maybe it's him. And if the Vikings were to say, hey, this is a guy that's different from Kirk Cousins. He has a huge arm. He can run. Wasn't used as much as a runner this past season. Has played in an offense with an NFL offensive coordinator. Liam Cohn was with the Rams and at Kentucky, back with the Rams now. That they could say, hey, look, this is our guy that is kind of away from the mold of a Kirk Cousins. I could see him being the guy that's just because he's a little older and he wasn't great in 2022, ultimately be of the top 4, the quarterback who falls a little bit.
And I should mention that there was a report from our friend Tom Pelissero, Minnesotan from NFL Network, that the Vikings are not interested in signing Kirk Cousins to a 1-year extension. I don't want to misquote him and say not interested, but he doesn't expect that to happen with a 1-year contract, which we've talked about that a little bit on the show about why would Kirk Cousins sign a 1-year extension when he's going to want a final contract here for his career, and he just won 13 games. And if you're the Vikings, do you really want to lock yourself into him after his best year? And if you fall off next year, then what do you do?
Yeah.
And if you try to sneak a Derek Carr contract, not by this man's agent.
No way.
This man's agent is a beast. So there's
Kirk's smart with that stuff
right.
too. He's like the greatest negotiating quarterback ever.
Exactly. So there's no way that he's just taking whatever for a contract. Sign me up, boys. Get me back out there. And I think that makes quarterback part of this conversation.
It does.
And I guess I wonder about, and I don't like this idea, but I have to bring it up just because the development quarterback, the guy that isn't necessarily going to be one of the top 4, but anybody else. Is there anybody else in your mind? You're making a face worth watching in this draft that maybe not at 23, but say the Vikings were to trade back? Is there anybody else that would catch your interest?
For Vikings fans and for Purple Insider listeners, I do not want there to be a Kellen Mond 2.0 situation. There's not. I don't even really like Hendon Hooker that much. He's going to be 26 during the playoffs next year. He's 25. He's 25. He just turned 25 in January. I
remember when me and Hendon Hooker were watching Scott Norwood kick it wide right as kids.
Yeah,
he's
that
coming
old.
out in the draft. Good
he's
for
that
him.
old. Yeah, exactly. Hendon Hooker is a name that you'll probably hear because of his great season that he had at Tennessee. I actually just finalized his grade recently. I totally missed him, which I don't know how I did that. I was not that impressed. I thought the talent around him was amazing. It was a wide open air raid system, a lot of misses down the field on his film, and he's taller, tried to run, but he doesn't look explosive. He's not going to run at the next level. There's not really any other guy that I think is a big time sleeper who no one is really thinking about, that third, fourth round you could pick and develop. Jaron Hall from BYU is probably the only one, but he's another older prospect as well. I think he's 24, 25 already. Kind of in the Zach Wilson mold where he can create outside of the pocket a little bit, has a live arm, 2 good seasons back-to-back after filling in for Zach Wilson at BYU. Those two are the only ones I think that will be talked about, but I'm not even really too high on either of them, Hooker or Jaron Hall.
Tanner McKee looks like a young Daniel Jones to me,
Yeah.
or a young, I don't know, Nick Foles, early in his career. But I agree with you on Hendon Hooker, though. That's like being in college and going back and playing for your high school football team.
Yes.
I mean, that's just a completely
You have to think
level.
about that with the draft. You're drafting a 25-year-old who's about to turn 26.
Right. He modeled his game after Terry Bradshaw. Very few people know that. But it is, that to me is not that interesting, because if you're talking about a development player,
when do you want him on the field? 28, 29?
Right. Exactly. So I agree with you that it's probably pointless. I did want to bring up that I heard recently that I remember you liked Kellen Mond. And I remember, now we talk about Kellen Mond. It didn't work out. You felt bad about that because you want to get them all right.
I do.
But I've heard that you weren't the only one. Some people have brought up to me that there were some teams that had Kellen Mond ahead of Justin Fields, which tells you about the inexact science of the draft and of the quarterback situation. But I do think that the league usually tells us the deal. If somebody drops to the third, there's really no point going after him. And I think if the Vikings were trying to hedge, if I hear this year, well, Brock Purdy was found in this, I'm going to lose my mind. I'm going to hear that tomorrow, aren't I? When we go over there and those guys, well, Brock Purdy was a 7th round pick and that worked out pretty well for them. That never happens.
Yeah, no. And with Kellen Mond, what was weird about that and why I think I liked him as a prospect. I didn't love him. I liked it for the Vikings because I thought he was a very similar to Kirk Cousins quarterback. In this scenario, if the Vikings are we're not going to extend Kirk Cousins, we want a developmental guy, and let's hope for the Vikings' sake that they're going to aim for a different style of quarterback, aim a little bit higher. You don't pick someone like Kellen Mond. You don't pick someone like Tanner McKee or Hendon Hooker that does not have ad-libbing ability, that doesn't have a big arm, that's not doing those wow things at the quarterback position physically that the best quarterbacks in the game are doing. So, yeah, Kellen Mond was kind of the old school mentality. Had he entered the draft 10 years earlier, in terms of he was from Jimbo Fisher's offense, under center, getting through his reads, but you kind of saw that with how fast the game is today, and I think just how offenses are kind of leaning toward the designed run game for quarterbacks, what that does to the numbers game in the box, what it does to coverages, bringing the safety down, whatever. If you don't have that ability and then you can't fit it through tight windows with how much zone is being played today, 75% of the league in that range is playing zone a lot, that you're just not going to be able to succeed. And if you are a backup and you do get your chance in the preseason or in a regular season game where you have to be good right away to make that good first impression, it's going to be very, very challenging to do so.
Yeah, and I thought that with Mond, maybe they thought he was something that he wasn't, because they talked about his athleticism and stuff, and I was kind of like, is that really true? Because I don't really college athleticism
Is
versus
different.
NFL athleticism is so much different. I mean, you should really, if you're going to be talked about as an athletic freak, you should be Anthony Richardson. You should be Will Levis arm strength, because almost nothing. Like, I remember Baker Mayfield was talked about a little bit. Like,
Athletic.
he's pretty athletic. He's
Johnny
pretty mobile.
Manziel too.
Right. And then they get to the NFL, like, not at all.
Cannot run.
Right. You're not running away from defensive tackles who run a 4.6.
Yep.
Speaking of which, I want to get into a couple other positions with you, and then we can circle back on what actually happened later in later pods after the combine results are all finished and everything else. But I am so fascinated by the cornerback position, not just because the Vikings brought in Brian Flores, who is going to need corners. And I do wonder, like, how happy everyone would be with a corner, considering they drafted 2 last year, 2 in 2020, but sunk cost. Like, if you don't have one, you don't have one. But I keep looking for a consensus on who the guys are, and I can't find one. I find, PFF's draft simulator likes about 3 or 4 in the first round. But I'd love to hear your opinion, and especially guys that might work out for man coverage, which Brian Flores is going to play a lot of. But there seems to be no consensus at all going into the combine of where these guys should be taken.
Yeah, there's not like a Derek Stingley, Sauce Gardner, like they're at the top, and then who else is behind them in this class. But fortunately for the Vikings, and then more specifically for Brian Flores' scheme that's going to play a lot of man and prefers longer corners. They had Byron Jones, Xavier Howard in Miami. It's a really, really good class at the top. Christian Gonzalez from Oregon. I love the fact that he's like 21 years old, and he was at Colorado, was very good there, transferred to Oregon, kind of played, both in the Pac-12, but played up a little bit. And was really good this past season. There's a lot of comparisons to Patrick Surtain. I don't think he's quite as technically good as Patrick Surtain was. He didn't have the dad in the NFL teaching him since he was 5, like Patrick Surtain had. Joey Porter Jr., another one with NFL bloodlines. Very long, very twitchy, feisty. Put him on an island in the NFL. Do not let him sit and sink in zone. That's not where he's best. And then Devin Witherspoon from Illinois. He's a little smaller, but he's still going to meet most thresholds, right around 6 foot, 180, 185 pounds, 190 pounds, and probably the feistiest of the bunch of those top 3 at this position, where in your face the entire route, very physical, but not too grabby. And I think why there's not really a consensus at this point with those 3, you can throw in Keely Ringo from Georgia as well. You'll hear it from Daniel Jeremiah and Rich Eisen when they're working out this weekend. So much emphasis gets put on the cornerbacks workouts. Like, if you don't run like sub 4.45, you're not going to go in the first round. Like, they want, like, teams historically and even recently want to see the speed, the vertical. If you don't cross off a lot of those boxes, then you're just not going to be picked very high. It feels like Christian Gonzalez, Joey Porter Jr., and Devin Witherspoon and Keely Ringo are all going to test very, very well. But the 3 that I first mentioned, they are on an island press man corners that have the length that I think teams, and certainly in this case, Brian Flores and the Vikings, will really covet and like in this draft.
And I guess the question then becomes, like, is one of them going to be there at 23? When you win 13 games, they don't give you a very high draft pick. I don't know. It's a little known fact. By the way, Joey Porter Jr. is so old that Hendon Hooker grew up watching him, just like his dad.
Like
yeah. So I didn't deliver the roast that well on him being old. But Joey Porter Jr. definitely makes me feel on the aged side.
Yes, me
when you
too.
talk about him. But I saw a little bit of him at Penn State and thought he was a tremendous prospect. It's just with him and Gonzalez, they're probably going to go too early for the Vikings to consider. And this is a scenario that I played out in a draft simulation, because it's that time of year.
Yes.
But trading back and then taking a corner a little later, I think this is a little bit risky behavior, because if you want a great corner, you usually have to take them high. There's so much physical, like you said, physical ability just plays so much into it that if you're not a freak show, you probably don't become elite. But the Vikings just need good corners. And I think that if they trade back second round, maybe they have a chance to get somebody there, as opposed to taking a swing at who's sort of ever remaining once Gonzalez and Porter Jr. have gone.
Yeah, to your last point, I think in general you can get a quote-unquote good cornerback in round 2, but I think with Brian Flores, he's going to have a specific type, and they ask for the length and the athleticism and the ball skills that he had in Miami with those two, Byron Jones and Xavier Howard. I think that's probably what he, in an ideal world, he's going to try to replicate to get those two. One other name I completely forgot, not on purpose, Cam Smith from South Carolina.
Yeah.
He's the other one. I don't think he's quite as athletic. And we'll certainly get to see. That's what's great about the combine. It's not just my opinion on how athletic someone feels on film. We'll get to see it. But his 2021 was as good of a non-entering cornerback film that I've watched in a long, long time. He was around the football something like 25% of his targets, which is a crazy high number. On an island, physical, probably at times a little bit too physical, but he would be the fourth guy in there as well. I'm not talking about Keely Ringo as much. He's going to test well, but I think he's more of a zone corner. Maybe we'll play safety at the next level. So with 4 corners there, I feel like at 23, there's a decent chance that at least one of them is available. And certainly inside the Viking scouting department, we don't know who they're going to like more than the other, but in a kind of, being outsiders here to say, if they really want a long press man corner who's athletic, they will be able to probably get one at 23.
I think that in this case, we can really identify that pretty clearly. Like if they're going to pick them, it's going to be this guy, or this guy.
Yes.
And we got to get the measurements, the speed, the length, all those types of things. Yep. But I think we're just going to know generally if they're looking at that type, who are they going to be looking at? Can I ask you, this is a total side road, just getting off at an exit here. But a question that I get all the time is about scouts. And the Vikings have not drafted super well recently outside of, a future Hall of Famer, potentially Justin Jefferson,
he is.
And then an all-pro caliber tackle in Christian Darrisaw. But aside from that, it's been a pretty rough ride. And people ask about the scouts all the time. And I just can't get myself to a place where I think like, yeah, they should fire all those people, because I feel like they've scout so many players and then you draft 10 of them. And who even knows, where was that the guy that your scouting department wanted, or was it a coach, or was it Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, or was it like, I just have a really tough time picking it apart. I think that most scouts really know what they're doing, and it comes down to just the tiniest sample of players that they've evaluated. And if they loved Lewis Seen, for example, well, so did everybody else.
Yeah.
And the Cowboys reportedly, or at least from that picture that was taken, had him even higher than the Vikings. So I don't know. Like, I didn't see anyone say like, oh, Lewis Seen, what a terrible prospect, or something like that. So I always have trouble with this thing about like trying to critique a scouting department when they didn't show me the scouting reports.
No, that's true. And one quick aside from this, I'm really looking forward to getting some leak from the Cowboys draft board like we get every single year. It'll happen again. No, this is one of my favorite conversations to have during the pre-draft process, because I think you're spot on that these scouts are doing a good job, like with pretty much every team. And there's so many cooks in the kitchen, and usually the director of college scouting, assistant GM, and the GM are the ones ultimately pulling the trigger. But what I always find fascinating is that when, I don't know if just the Vikings do it, but I know like the Bills do it, a lot of teams, like right after they pick a player, like the next day they'll show like the moments leading up to it, and then and they have a whole highlight package ready, and they loved Dawson Knox and they were zeroing in on him. But then if you talk to Brandon Beane or anyone in the organization before, it's like, we're just going to go best player available when we're on the clock. So how did you know that Dawson Knox was going to be there, that you were going to trade up for him or whatever? So I definitely think that there are times where, maybe there was people in the Eagles organization that loved Justin Jefferson, and they just weren't the guys pressing, we want to draft Justin Jefferson, or vice versa, where the Vikings didn't know Justin Jefferson was going to be there. There's the famous video, obviously, Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer being overjoyed, where they would have maybe had to do a highlight package of Jalen Reagor because maybe he was their next wide receiver on the board. So the whole firing scouts right after the draft, if you have a bad draft, I think is a little bit of like a whipping boy scenario, like a cop out for the higher ups, which we see in a lot of other industries as well. But yes, I do think in general, the scouting departments, the scouts that are out there, they watch every single snap and they're very good at their jobs.
Well, and the way that you could tell that the scouts overall know what they're doing is not just what one team does, but what the whole league does.
Mm-hmm.
So if the whole league decides that somebody is an elite draft pick and picks him in the first round, like they just have way better chances of success. If these people didn't have any idea what they were doing, then we would see all over the map. It would be seventh rounders make it and first rounders make it and first, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it is to
It would
some
be more
extent,
even.
but
It would be more
right,
even.
right. When you look at anytime this has ever been studied, it's like the success goes straight down. So every pick that you have later is less of a chance to get a great player than it is than the last one, because these people know what they're doing. But that doesn't mean they're infallible. That means there's probably 100 different opinions about every player. And I just don't know how to answer that question when I get it. Like, I don't know. Like, are you talking about a specific scout? Well, I don't know what he said. And I guess if they don't like a specific scout that got something blatantly wrong, then they can fire that person. But are they like, I don't know. Like, I don't think that a few years of bad drafting defensive players is proof. Really, it's because you haven't drafted them high. And so this actually goes to a place I wanted to talk with you about, which is edge rushers and defensive tackles.
Mm-hmm.
The previous regime thought that they could find these players
anywhere
here in Indy. They could go over to the Top Steakhouse and just find an edge rusher, third or fourth round. Does that guy look like Danielle Hunter? Does to me. Let's grab him. I think that edge rushers and defensive tackles should really be on the table. But I notice that there is not like a bevy of them that are being talked up as we go into the combine here. Does that mean opportunity, or is this not a great draft for pass rushers?
The edge rusher class is way better than the interior defensive line class. So with that thinking, I mean, you can kind of approach it multiple ways and say, hey, well, there's still going to be quality players at D tackle in round 3 or round 4. Or you say, hey, we got to pick one early because the Kalijah Cansey from Pittsburgh, Mozzie Smith from Michigan, like they're going to be there. And then there's this precipitous drop off. The edge rushers, though, I think the Vikings, not to say that they should continue what they did in the past with 3rd, 4th, 5th rounders, it is a good class. They should be able to get one and not have to pick, at 23 overall and still get a quality player. But we know how edge rusher is such a premium position. Those will fly off the board within the first 50 to 75 picks a lot faster than the defensive tackle class. So if you're a Vikings fan, a Purple Insider listener, and thinking they need defensive tackle so bad, they need to do that way earlier than wait on that, because the defensive tackle class is not very good.
I do think that. I really do. I mean, I think with Delvin Tomlinson, even if they re-sign him and they have Harrison Phillips there, that's a big investment in that position. Neither one of those guys can get sacks. And I think it matters when you can get pressure up the middle, get sacks, create turnovers. Like Delvin Tomlinson has good PFF numbers and win rates and everything else, but he gets like 3 sacks. And it's great to push the pocket, but you're not getting strip sacks. You're not creating massive negative plays, and no one's scared of you. If the other team is scared of you, then they have to game plan for you. It helps everybody else. There was also, did I tell you about this? I don't know if I did. I brought it up a couple times on the show, but I was really captivated by it. The Athletic wrote an article about why all of the all pros on the defensive side were top draft picks. And yet the offensive side, the quarterbacks, of course, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, guys like that. The quarterbacks, okay. But a lot of the other positions were more spread out, like wide receiver, running back. We know all about that. Offensive line. And the conclusion that they came to is that basically defense, it's going to matter more for your athletic freakishness, which means draft higher. Whereas offense, it's so technical, route running, offensive line, the most technical position on the field. Running back, there's just 10 gazillion of them, but tight end, a very, very technical position. I think there's something to that. I think that when the Vikings look at this, they can't say, let's just grab another 3rd rounder and hope he turns into Danielle Hunter. Danielle Hunter and Everson Griffin were the outliers of all outliers, and we're both athletic psychopaths. I mean, 2 of the best athletes you'll ever find in your life. No way the NFL today would allow those guys to drop as far as they did, even with some Everson Griffin stuff or with Danielle Hunter's lack of production. I think that makes a pretty good argument that if you're going to stay at 23, you should get somebody who can rush the passer because they're going to need it all over the defensive line within the next few years.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you hit the nail on the head that with defensive line, and I am writing this a lot in my scouting reports, whether it's an edge rusher or a interior defensive lineman, you need to win fast. And there's some very nuanced players that have pass rush moves, but if it takes them 1.5 to 2 seconds to beat the offensive lineman, and then they're not exactly explosive to get into the backfield, and they're maybe starting to generate a pressure at around 3 seconds or more, that's too long. It takes way too long. So I actually moved in my scouting grade book last year. I used to have pass rush moves as my highest weighted category for defense for edge rushers and defensive linemen. It's now explosiveness. If you cannot get off the ball in under, I don't know, a half a second, and then whether it's a bull rush, whether it's a swim move, whatever, then it doesn't matter. So I think you're right. And that article did kind of shed light on that it makes sense that a lot of these guys were higher draft picks because a lot of the traits go very early, and these teams think, hey, we can coach these guys up with our defensive line coach or our linebackers coach, but you need the explosiveness. And you can certainly, have a guy shed weight or whatever, but it's very hard, I think, to teach explosiveness at the next level.
And you can actually see that Seth Walder from ESPN sometimes tweets out these stats where they can actually show who is getting off the ball the quickest in the NFL as defensive ends, which is just absolutely bananas. But that's like what the next gen stuff is doing for us, giving us a lot more insight into this stuff. And maybe they have it for college. I don't know.
I don't know if they have it for that.
The teams have some of that. I know that they have a lot of the data for the combine, way more data than is just shown publicly, which may play into it. But I definitely think that the twitchiness, the quickness, when you look at it mapped out for who the elite guys are, they're the ones that are dominating in the NFL as well. So let's go through the kickers one by one, each kicker, each punter. No, I'm just kidding. But
I'm not there yet.
You will be, though. You will know at least one kicker, punter, and long snapper who could get taken. But I did want to ask just what else is on your mind that we didn't cover here, because I think it's Vikings fans are going to have their eyes on the quarterback situation, defensive pass rushers, cornerbacks at the top of the list. I know for me also, wide receivers have not really separated themselves. I am a Zay Flowers fan at the moment, but that could change. He put on a bunch of weight. We'll see how fast he is. I like the idea of a Vikings first round wide receiver because I will just pound this table that you need more weapons until it someday, somehow they draft one extra wide receiver they didn't need. I will keep doing it. So that would be the other thing that we didn't cover. We'll get into how those guys perform and such at some point. Was there anything else on your mind?
No, I'm glad that you said wide receiver because I feel like we have like it in our contract here that we've made between each other that we need to talk about the wide receiver position and hammer that point home with the Vikings, that I'm really looking forward to how this wide receiver class collectively tests. That there's not a Jamar Chase, there's not a Jalen Waddle, there's not going to be a top 5 to 7 pick at the receiver spot. Most likely Quentin Johnston is kind of the consensus wide receiver one, but he's coming from this like wide open Big 12 air raid offense. The Big 12 receivers historically have not been very good because the route trees are just not there. And I think in today's NFL, certainly athleticism matters at all positions. It matters at wide receiver, but like you've seen with Justin Jefferson, that the nuanced ability to separate is not just how fast you are or how quick you are. It's how good of a route salesman you are, so to speak. Quentin Jefferson doesn't necessarily have that. And then Zay Flowers, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Jordan Addison, Jaden Reed, who I really like a lot from Michigan State. There's a lot of these kind of like, they could maybe be second or third rounders, or they could run themselves into the first round. Certainly feels like at that number 23 spot, there probably will be only one, maybe 2 receivers off the board at that point. So if Jordan Addison doesn't run crazy fast, he could certainly be there for them. And he was someone that was breaking out at 19 years old at Pittsburgh that I think could be your immediate, almost higher end wide receiver too, that you're getting on a cheap contract to play behind Justin Jefferson and maybe Adam Thielen as well. So I'm just interested to see, because it's kind of a down receiver class after we thought, every year we're going to have this amazing receiver class because of how college football is. I just want to see how they test. Maybe it's disappointing and we're like, hey, there's going to be one receiver in the first round. It's going to be like 2018 where it was just Calvin Ridley and DJ Moore, 1 or 2 in the first round, and all of the value will be later. Or will it be like 2019 where everyone ran super fast and you got DK Metcalf and AJ Brown, Terry McLaurin on day 2, who ultimately became really good receivers.
And with receivers, like we were just talking about, the technical elements, sometimes they don't blow away the combine, but there's definitely you have to be this tall to get onto the ride to be a star wide receiver or a really good wide receiver. And that was always what was weird to me about Justin Jefferson. The dude blew up the combine and he was amazing in the combine. I think he was like 97th percentile when you put it all together on relative athletic score. Relative athletic score
Love
season, folks. But I was just like chuckling to myself about Addison because I was looking over some things with him as, researching the receivers. It's like, where do I know this guy from? And then you brought up he was with Pitt. It's like, oh yeah, that's right. Nobody stays with their team anymore.
Yeah.
So you have to track them. I was like, man, I seem to recognize this guy. Oh yeah, that's right. He made Kenny Pickett a first-round draft pick. So anyway, well, we're here in Indianapolis. We're going to have a lot more great discussions to go. We will hear from the general manager, the head coach, and you're going to be also at some different podiums as well, listening to other things that GMs and coaches are saying, not to mention that there's always NFL Network reporter, ESPN reporter buzz that we'll have time to go over as well. So we'll react to Kwesi, we'll react to Kevin O'Connell in the next few days. Make sure you keep an eye out for that. And also we will have lots of other things to deep dive into with these players for a very interesting week here in Indianapolis. So thanks so much for listening to this episode. So much more to come from Indianapolis. We will talk to you all soon.